It was a quiet evening, the kind where the hum of tires on asphalt blends with the distant chirping of crickets. Judge Marcus Thompson sat behind the wheel of his sedan, his mind still replaying the day's events at the courthouse. He had spent hours ensuring justice was served fairly, listening to arguments, and making decisions that would impact lives. Now, all he wanted was to get home, unwind, and maybe enjoy a warm cup of tea before calling it a night. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional car passing by. The soft glow of streetlights illuminated the road ahead. As Marcus drove through the suburbs, it was peaceful, until red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. His heart sank slightly. A traffic stop. He hadn't been speeding, and he knew his car was in perfect condition. Still, he pulled over smoothly, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. Officer Greg Hargrove stepped out of his patrol car, his boots clicking against the pavement. He adjusted his belt and approached Marcus's vehicle with an air of authority. To Marcus, something about the officer's demeanor felt off right away. Instead of the usual polite inquiry, Hargrove barked, "License and registration," without even explaining why he'd been stopped. Marcus took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay composed. He rolled down his window and greeted the officer politely. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady. But Hargrove didn't soften. Instead, he pointed to the back of the car. "Your taillight's busted," he said curtly, though his tone suggested this wasn't just about a minor traffic violation. Marcus glanced at his rearview mirror, confused. He could have sworn he checked his car earlier that morning. Still, he nodded and reached for his glove compartment to retrieve the documents. As he did, Hargrove snapped, "Keep your hands where I can see them." The sharpness in his voice made Marcus freeze momentarily. Slowly, he raised his hands, then explained, "I'm just getting my papers, sir." Hargrove's eyes narrowed. There was something cold and dismissive in his gaze, as if he'd already decided what kind of person Marcus was before they'd exchanged more than a few words. For Marcus, the situation felt eerily familiar, a reminder of countless stories he'd heard from friends, colleagues, and strangers who had faced similar treatment simply because of the color of their skin. As the seconds ticked by, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be a routine stop. Hargrove lingered unnecessarily, peering into the car as though searching for some hidden excuse to escalate things. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing moment. Yet, despite the unease creeping up his spine, Marcus resolved to remain calm. He had learned long ago that losing his temper wouldn't help. Staying level-headed was the only way to navigate situations like this. Little did Marcus know, this encounter was about to take a turn that neither he nor the officer could have anticipated. What started as a simple traffic stop was about to become a story that shocked not just the small suburban town, but also the nation. Judge Marcus Thompson handed over his license and registration, his fingers steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. He decided to try diffusing the tension. "Officer, I'm Judge Marcus Thompson," he said calmly, his tone polite but firm. "I don't believe my taillight is broken. I had it checked recently. Is there anything else you're concerned about?" Instead of softening, Officer Hargrove's expression hardened further. His lips curled into a sneer as he glanced at the documents in his hand. "A judge, huh?" he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Must be nice to have all those connections." The way he emphasized the word made it clear what he was implying. That someone like Marcus, a black man, couldn't possibly hold such a position without outside help. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to stay composed. He'd dealt with prejudice before, both subtle and overt, but this felt personal. This wasn't just disrespect. It was an outright challenge to his identity and authority. "I assure you, officer, my position has nothing to do with connections," Marcus replied evenly. "If you'd like, we can discuss this further once you confirm the issue with my vehicle." Hargrove ignored him, flipping through the papers with exaggerated slowness. "You know," he said after a pause, his tone mocking, "most people show a little more respect when they're talking to an officer of the law." Marcus blinked, surprised by the accusation. "I've been respectful from the start," he said, keeping his voice measured. "But I also expect fairness. If there's no actual violation here, I'd appreciate being allowed to go on my way." The officer leaned closer, resting one hand on the roof of the car and the other on the open window frame. His face was inches from Marcus's now, his breath hot and heavy. "Fairness," Hargrove repeated, his voice rising. "You want to talk about fairness. How about pulling over when you're told instead of arguing every little thing?" Marcus resisted the urge to lean back. He knew better than to let the officer intimidate him. "I pulled over immediately," he countered, his patience wearing thin. "And I've cooperated fully. But if you're going to accuse me of something, I'd appreciate knowing exactly what it is." For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them crackled with unspoken tension. Hargrove's eyes narrowed, studying Marcus as though trying to find some flaw, some justification for his hostility. But Marcus met his gaze squarely, refusing to look away. It was a battle of wills, one man asserting power, the other demanding dignity. Finally, Hargrove straightened up, his posture rigid. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered abruptly, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. Marcus frowned. "Why? I haven't done anything wrong." "Don't make me repeat myself," Hargrove snapped, his hand moving toward the holster on his belt. Out of the car. Now. The escalation was sudden and jarring. Marcus hesitated, weighing his options. Complying might defuse the situation, but it could also embolden the officer. Refusing, however, risked making things worse. In that split second, he chose the middle ground. "Officer, I'll step out if you explain why you're asking me to do so. Otherwise, I'm within my rights to remain seated." Hargrove's face flushed red with anger. "You think you're special because you're a judge." He spat. "Let me tell you something. Out here, you're just another driver. And right now, you're acting suspicious." Marcus clenched his fists briefly under the dashboard, out of sight. Suspicious. For doing nothing more than asking questions. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, headlights appeared in the distance. A car slowed down as it approached, its driver craning their neck to see what was happening. For the first time, Hargrove seemed distracted, glancing over his shoulder at the newcomer. Unbeknownst to either man, this small interruption would set off a chain of events neither could have predicted. What started as a tense standoff was about to spiral into something far bigger and far more consequential than either of them could imagine. As the second car slowed down, its headlights casting long shadows across the quiet street, Officer Hargrove turned his head just enough to notice the newcomer. It was a silver sedan, and behind the wheel sat Sarah Collins, a young law student who had been interning under Judge Thompson for the past few months. She didn't recognize the patrol car at first. Just another routine traffic stop, or so she thought. But as her car inched closer, something about the scene caught her attention. Sarah's eyes widened when she realized whose car was pulled over. That was Judge Thompson's sedan, her mentor, the man who had taught her the importance of fairness, patience, and standing up for what's right. What was happening here? Why was he being stopped? A flicker of unease passed through her as she noticed the tension between the two men, the officer's aggressive stance, and Marcus's rigid posture inside the car. Without thinking twice, Sarah pulled over safely a short distance away. She grabbed her phone from the passenger seat and opened the camera app. If this was going to escalate, and her gut told her it might, she wanted to make sure there was a record of it. From her vantage point, she could hear fragments of their conversation carried by the cool night air. The officer's tone was sharp, almost biting, while Marcus's voice remained calm but firm. Hargrove hadn't noticed Sarah yet. His focus was still trained on Marcus, his hand resting conspicuously close to his holster as he repeated his demand. "I said step out of the vehicle." He barked again, louder this time, his frustration evident. Marcus shook his head slightly, his expression resolute. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong," he replied, his voice steady despite the growing pressure. "You're asking me to comply without cause. I'm not stepping out until you explain yourself." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The standoff between the two men felt electric, charged with unspoken anger and defiance. Hargrove's face twisted into a scowl, his fingers twitching near his belt. To anyone watching, it was clear that this situation was teetering on the edge of control. Sarah adjusted her position slightly, ensuring her phone captured the entire interaction. Her hands trembled a little, but she steadied herself. This wasn't just about recording evidence, it was about bearing witness. She knew how quickly these moments could spiral, how easily they could be dismissed later if no one spoke up. And she couldn't let that happen, not to Judge Thompson, not to anyone. Back at the car, Marcus glanced briefly toward the silver sedan parked nearby. He noticed the faint glow of a phone screen, but couldn't see who was holding it. For a fleeting second, he wondered if help was close by, or if trouble was brewing. Either way, he couldn't afford to lose focus now. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said, addressing Hargrove directly. "This isn't just about me. It's about accountability. If you have a legitimate reason for this stop, fine. But if not, then we both know where this is heading." Hargrove scoffed, clearly unimpressed by the lecture. "Accountability," he echoed mockingly. "You don't get to lecture me about accountability, buddy. Not tonight." The word buddy dripped with condescension, and Marcus clenched his jaw. Every instinct told him to push back harder, to call out the injustice unfolding before him. But years of experience had taught him that sometimes restraint was the strongest weapon. So instead of responding, he simply held the officer's gaze, refusing to look away. Meanwhile, Sarah continued filming, her heart pounding in her chest. She zoomed in slightly, capturing the details. The way Hargrove loomed over the car, the stiffness in Marcus's shoulders, the palpable tension hanging in the air. She wished she could intervene, say something to diffuse the situation. But she knew better. Her role right now was to observe, to document, and to trust that the truth would speak for itself. What none of them realized in that moment was how far-reaching the consequences of this encounter would be. Sarah's footage wouldn't just capture a single incident. It would spark a movement, igniting conversations about race, power, and justice across the nation. But for now, all she could do was press record, hoping against hope that things wouldn't escalate further. And yet, deep down, she feared they already had. Officer Hargrove's patience, or whatever remained of it, finally snapped. With a sharp motion, he reached for his handcuffs, the metallic clink slicing through the tense silence like a knife. "That's it," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "You're under arrest for obstruction." Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief. "Obstruction," he repeated, incredulous. "For what?" "Asking you to follow protocol." "This is absurd." But Hargrove wasn't listening anymore. He yanked open the car door, his movements forceful and deliberate, leaving no room for argument. "Get out of the car now, or I'll drag you out myself," he threatened, his tone leaving no doubt that he meant every word. The gravity of the situation hit Marcus like a ton of bricks. He knew better than anyone how quickly these moments could spiral out of control. Stories of similar encounters ending in tragedy flashed through his mind, but he pushed them aside. Panic wouldn't help him here. Clarity would. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the vehicle, keeping his hands visible at all times. His heart raced, but his face remained calm, masking the storm brewing inside him. As soon as Marcus stood upright, Hargrove grabbed his arm with unnecessary force, twisting it behind his back. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Marcus's wrists as they were secured tightly. "This is excessive," Marcus said firmly, wincing slightly at the pressure. "You're overstepping your authority." "Shut up," Hargrove shot back, shoving Marcus toward the patrol car. "You'll have plenty of time to talk back at the station." By now, the commotion had drawn attention. A small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk, murmurs rippling through the air as people tried to piece together what was happening. Some recognized Marcus immediately. One shouted, "Hey, isn't that Judge Thompson?" Another voice chimed in, louder this time. "What's going on? Why are you arresting him?" Sarah, still filming from her parked car, felt her pulse quicken. She stepped out cautiously, staying just far enough away to avoid drawing direct attention, but close enough to ensure her phone captured everything. Her hands trembled as she zoomed in on the scene, capturing the growing tension between the officer and the bystanders. "You can't treat him like this," someone yelled, their voice laced with anger. Others nodded in agreement, their expressions a mix of shock and outrage. One man even pulled out his own phone, joining Sarah in documenting the incident. Within moments, the quiet street transformed into a stage for public scrutiny, with cameras rolling and voices rising in protest. Hargrove glanced around nervously, clearly unsettled by the sudden audience. "Back off," he barked, waving a hand at the crowd. "This doesn't concern any of you." But the crowd wasn't backing down. If anything, their presence only emboldened them further. Someone called out, "We know who you are, Officer Hargrove. We've seen your name in the papers before." The jab landed hard, referencing the unresolved complaints against him. Hargrove's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he focused on shoving Marcus into the backseat of the patrol car, slamming the door shut with more force than necessary. Inside the car, Marcus sat perfectly still, his mind racing. He knew the weight of the moment, not just for himself, but for everyone watching. This wasn't just about one man being wrongfully detained. It was about exposing the cracks in a system that allowed such injustices to happen. And as the engine roared to life and the patrol car pulled away, leaving the crowd behind, Marcus silently vowed to fight back, not with rage, but with truth. Meanwhile, Sarah lowered her phone, her chest heaving with emotion. She had recorded everything: the officer's aggression, the crowd's reaction, and the undeniable injustice of it all. As she climbed back into her car, her thoughts turned to what came next. This footage wasn't just evidence, it was a call to action, and she intended to make sure the world saw it. Little did she know, her decision to press record would change lives, including her own, in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Back at the police station, chaos erupted almost immediately. Word of Judge Marcus Thompson's arrest spread like wildfire among courthouse staff, local attorneys, and community leaders. Phones buzzed incessantly as texts and emails flew back and forth. "Did you hear? They arrested Judge Thompson." The news hit hard, especially because everyone knew the kind of man Marcus was: fair, principled, and deeply respected. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It felt like an attack on justice itself. Within minutes, a group of judges, lawyers, and colleagues mobilized. Emergency calls were made to civil rights organizations, influential figures in the legal community, and even the mayor's office. Some worked tirelessly to file motions for Marcus's immediate release, while others began drafting press releases to ensure the public wouldn't remain in the dark. One thing was clear: this couldn't be swept under the rug. Meanwhile, Sarah Collins sat in her parked car, her hands trembling as she uploaded the video she'd recorded earlier. She hesitated briefly before hitting post, knowing that sharing the footage could put her in the spotlight, and possibly at odds with authorities. But something inside her whispered that this was bigger than fear. With a deep breath, she added a caption: "This is what injustice looks like. We can't stay silent anymore." The response was instantaneous. Within seconds, notifications flooded her phone: likes, shares, comments, and messages of support pouring in from strangers across the city. Within hours, the hashtag Justice for Judge Thompson began trending online. People shared stories of their own encounters with racial profiling, amplifying the outrage. Local activists joined the conversation, calling for accountability and systemic reform. What started as a single video soon became a rallying cry for change. At the station, Officer Hargrove couldn't ignore the growing storm outside. Reporters gathered at the entrance, microphones in hand, demanding answers. Protesters chanted slogans, holding signs that read, "No justice, no peace, and accountability now." Inside, Hargrove tried to act unfazed, but beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he fielded increasingly hostile questions from his superiors. Calls poured in from higher-ups, each one more urgent than the last. "What were you thinking?" one commander barked during a tense meeting. "Do you have any idea what this has done to our department?" For Marcus, sitting quietly in a holding cell, the noise outside felt distant yet reassuring. He had faith in the system, not blindly, but because he understood its power when people stood together. Still, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. He thought about all the others who hadn't been so lucky, whose stories never made headlines. His arrest wasn't just about him. It was a reflection of a much larger issue. And if this ordeal could shine a light on that truth, then perhaps it would be worth it. By midnight, the pressure became too much for the police department to ignore. A judge signed an emergency order for Marcus's release, citing insufficient grounds for his detention. As he walked out of the station, flanked by supporters and flashing cameras, Marcus kept his head high. He didn't smile or raise his fists in triumph. Instead, he carried himself with quiet dignity, letting his presence speak louder than words. The crowd erupted into applause as he stepped onto the sidewalk. Someone handed him a megaphone, and though he hadn't planned to say anything, he took it anyway. "Thank you," he began, his voice calm but powerful. "Tonight isn't about me. It's about every person who has faced injustice and lived to tell the tale. Let this be a reminder that we are stronger together. Let this spark real change." His words resonated deeply, not just with those present, but with countless others watching online. By morning, the story dominated news outlets nationwide. Videos of the arrest, coupled with Marcus's impassioned speech, sparked debates about policing, bias, and accountability. For many, it was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that progress required action, not just words. And as the sun rose over the city, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The days following Judge Marcus Thompson's arrest were a whirlwind of activity. The public outcry was deafening, and the pressure on law enforcement to act became impossible to ignore. Internal Affairs launched an immediate investigation into Officer Greg Hargrove's conduct, not just this incident, but his entire history. Files that had been buried or overlooked for years were suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Complaints from previous traffic stops, accusations of racial profiling, and even whispers of tampered evidence began surfacing like ghosts from the past. For Hargrove, the walls were closing in fast. His colleagues, once loyal, now avoided him in the hallways. Some whispered behind his back, while others outright condemned him. "You brought this on yourself," one officer muttered during roll call, loud enough for everyone to hear. It wasn't sympathy Hargrove lacked, it was support. Even his superiors distanced themselves, issuing statements that painted him as a rogue actor rather than a reflection of the department. Suspended without pay pending the outcome of the investigation, Hargrove retreated to his home, blinds drawn, phone silenced. But there was no escaping the storm he'd ignited. Meanwhile, Judge Thompson held a press conference that drew national attention. Standing at a podium adorned with microphones bearing the logos of major news networks, Marcus exuded calm authority, flanked by civil rights leaders, legal experts, and Sarah Collins, the young law student whose video had sparked the movement. He addressed the crowd with a mix of resolve and compassion. "This isn't about revenge," Marcus began, his voice steady and measured. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I went through simply because of the color of their skin." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Officer Hargrove made a choice that night, a choice rooted in prejudice and fear. But we must also recognize that individuals alone don't create these systems. We all bear responsibility for dismantling them. His speech struck a chord. Instead of calling for punishment, Marcus emphasized rehabilitation and reform. He urged Officer Hargrove, and others like him, to confront their biases, to seek understanding instead of clinging to hate. "I believe people can change," Marcus said, looking directly into the cameras. "But change requires honesty, humility, and action. Let this moment be a catalyst, not just for justice, but for healing." The audience erupted in applause, not out of anger, but out of hope. For many, Marcus's words offered a path forward, a way to channel outrage into progress. Local activists seized the momentum, organizing marches, town halls, and workshops aimed at fostering dialogue between communities and law enforcement. Protest signs gave way to collaborative efforts, citizens and officers sitting together in community meetings, sharing stories, and brainstorming solutions. Even Sarah found herself thrust into the heart of the movement. Her courage earned her widespread recognition, and she became a symbol of how ordinary people could make extraordinary impacts. Invitations poured in, from universities asking her to speak, from organizations seeking her input, and even from prestigious law firms offering internships. But Sarah remained grounded, crediting Judge Thompson for inspiring her to act. "I didn't do anything special," she told reporters humbly. "I just did what needed to be done." As the weeks passed, tangible changes began taking shape. The city council announced plans to implement body cameras for all officers, along with stricter penalties for misconduct. Independent oversight committees were formed, giving citizens a direct role in holding law enforcement accountable. Schools introduced programs designed to educate students about systemic racism and the importance of allyship. Slowly but surely, the seeds of transformation took root. Yet, for all the progress, Marcus knew the fight was far from over. True change wouldn't happen overnight. It would require vigilance, persistence, and unwavering commitment. As he stood beside Sarah after the press conference, watching the crowd disperse, he allowed himself a small smile. They had taken the first step, and sometimes that was enough. The ripple effects of Judge Marcus Thompson's arrest transformed the small suburban town in ways no one could have predicted. What began as a single act of recorded injustice evolved into a grassroots movement that united people from all walks of life. Local activists, inspired by Marcus's calm leadership and Sarah's bravery, organized a series of events aimed at fostering understanding and driving meaningful change. Peaceful protests became a regular occurrence, but they weren't just about chanting slogans or holding signs. They were opportunities for education and connection. One Saturday morning, hundreds gathered in the park for a unity march, where participants carried banners with messages like "Listen, Learn, Act, and Together We Rise." Speakers took turns addressing the crowd, sharing personal stories of discrimination and resilience. Among them was Sarah, who stood nervously behind the microphone, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with each word. "I never thought I'd be here today," she admitted, looking out at the sea of faces. "But when I saw what happened to Judge Thompson, I knew I couldn't stay silent. None of us can afford to stay silent. Not anymore." Her words resonated deeply, earning cheers and applause that echoed through the park. Later that afternoon, community leaders hosted a town hall meeting at the local library. The room buzzed with energy as residents packed themselves into rows of chairs, eager to engage in honest dialogue. Officers from the police department attended too, some visibly uncomfortable but willing to listen. Moderators guided discussions on topics ranging from racial bias in policing to the importance of transparency and accountability. For many attendees, it was the first time they had sat face-to-face with law enforcement outside of an official capacity. Tensions lingered, but so did hope, a shared desire to bridge divides and build trust. In schools across the district, teachers incorporated lessons about systemic racism and social justice into their curriculums. Students participated in projects designed to explore these issues creatively, writing essays, creating art, and even producing short films. At one high school, a group of students launched a campaign called Be the Change, encouraging peers to volunteer in underserved neighborhoods and advocate for policy reforms. Their efforts caught the attention of local news outlets, further amplifying their message. Even businesses got involved. A popular coffee shop downtown dedicated its walls to showcasing artwork created by marginalized artists, while donating proceeds from certain drinks to organizations fighting for equality. Nearby, a bookstore curated a special section featuring books on race, history, and activism, hosting weekly reading groups to spark conversations among patrons. Everywhere you looked, people were finding ways to contribute. No gesture was too small, no voice too insignificant. For Marcus, watching this wave of collective action unfold was both humbling and inspiring. He attended several events, lending his support and offering guidance whenever asked. But he also made sure to step back, allowing others to take the lead. "This isn't my movement," he told Sarah during one quiet moment. "It belongs to everyone who refuses to accept the status quo." As weeks turned into months, the changes began to solidify. The city council passed landmark legislation mandating implicit bias training for all public employees, including police officers. Body cameras became standard issue, with strict rules governing their use. Independent oversight committees gained real power, reviewing cases of misconduct and making recommendations for discipline. These measures weren't perfect, but they represented progress, and sometimes that was enough. Still, Marcus knew better than anyone that true transformation required more than policies and programs. It demanded a shift in mindset, a commitment to seeing one another not as adversaries, but as partners in building a fairer society. As he walked through the revitalized streets of his community, he felt a cautious optimism. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long time, it felt possible to imagine a brighter future, one built on empathy, accountability, and unity. Months after the night that changed everything, Officer Greg Hargrove found himself standing in a courtroom, not as an enforcer of the law, but as someone held accountable to it. The Internal Affairs investigation had uncovered a pattern of misconduct so undeniable that criminal charges were inevitable. Facing counts of civil rights violations and abuse of power, Hargrove eventually pleaded guilty in exchange for reduced sentencing. Yet, even as he accepted responsibility, his expression remained stoic, almost detached, as if he still couldn't grasp the magnitude of what he'd done. During the victim impact statement portion of the proceedings, Judge Marcus Thompson rose to speak. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him as he approached the podium. For a moment, he simply stood there, collecting his thoughts. Then, in a voice steady yet filled with emotion, he began. "Officer Hargrove's actions that night weren't just an attack on me. They were an attack on the principles of fairness and justice we all depend on. But I don't stand here today seeking vengeance. Instead, I ask you to reflect on this moment and see it as an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to become better." Marcus paused, glancing at Hargrove before continuing. "I believe people can change. Painful as this has been, I hope it serves as a turning point, not just for you, but for everyone watching. Let this be a reminder that our choices matter, and that accountability is not punishment. It's a chance to rebuild trust." His words hung in the air, resonating deeply with those present. Some nodded in agreement, while others wiped away tears. Even Hargrove seemed to soften slightly, his rigid posture relaxing for the first time since the trial began. When Marcus returned to his seat, the crowd erupted into quiet applause, a gesture of respect not just for him, but for the courage it took to respond to hatred with compassion. Outside the courthouse, the community continued its work toward lasting change. Sarah Collins, now interning at a prestigious civil rights law firm, thanks to her role in exposing the truth, became a mentor to young activists eager to make their voices heard. She often reflected on how far she'd come since that fateful night, marveling at how one act of bravery could ripple outward, touching lives in ways she never imagined. For Marcus, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as close to normal as possible after such a public ordeal. He resumed his duties at the courthouse, presiding over cases with the same unwavering fairness that defined him. But something had shifted within him too. He carried a renewed sense of purpose, using his platform to advocate for reforms beyond his courtroom. Whether speaking at conferences or meeting with policymakers, he reminded everyone that justice wasn't a destination. It was a journey requiring constant effort. The town itself bore little resemblance to what it once was. Community-police relations improved significantly, though challenges remained. Regular town halls kept lines of communication open, ensuring transparency and fostering mutual understanding. Programs aimed at youth empowerment flourished, giving teenagers tools to address inequality in their own lives. And perhaps most importantly, conversations about race and bias became normalized. No longer taboo subjects avoided out of discomfort. As the years passed, the story of Judge Thompson's arrest faded from headlines, but its legacy endured. It became a case study in universities, a topic of discussion in legislative sessions, and a source of inspiration for communities grappling with similar struggles. People remembered not just the injustice, but the resilience and unity it sparked. One evening, as Marcus drove home along the same quiet streets where it all began, he noticed something different. A mural now adorned the side of a building near the spot where he'd been pulled over. Painted by local artists, it depicted a diverse group of hands reaching upward, intertwined in solidarity. Beneath it were the words, "Justice starts with us." A small smile crossed Marcus's face as he drove past. The road ahead would always have obstacles, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Change might be slow, messy, and imperfect, but it was happening. And sometimes, that was enough.